Hey everybody, this is Jenny Clark with Solvability. We're here for GovCon Summit. This session is the Mike and Michael show. It's all about cybersecurity. They've both been in this field for a very long time, have a lot of information to share. And I'm just going to turn it over to Mike Schmidt. Let you take it away, Mike.
Thank you very much, Jenny. This is an absolutely amazing Odyssey program you've been putting together. I'm just starting off on the initial cam. I'm going to switch over to the dual cam so you can see both of us, and we'll present with that camera during the most of the presentation. But just wanted to let you know that Imprimis has been at this cybersecurity space and doing the assessment and compliance work, probably, Mike, since about 2010, right? Yep. I mean, the company was formed in 2004 and has been involved in the aerospace and satellite engineering markets, but really dived into this compliance area right around 2010 and developed an incredible tool for doing the assessments and compliance work for the 800-171 world. And as you know, in the last couple of years, as CMMC has been promulgated onto the defense base, we're all now dealing and struggling with that process. And Mike's put together some pretty darn good solutions for doing that here at Imprimis. And we'll talk a little bit more about Imprimis at the end. But I'm going to switch back over here and then go ahead and set up our dual camera. This is Mike Semmens. Mike, say hello to the group.
Hello, group. Nice to be here.
All right, I'm going to go ahead and start our share. And we'll dive into this presentation. We got about 30 slides, but we're going to talk fast, but I want you to listen quick. So this is kind of usually how that works. So let me go ahead and put that slide on.
Will there be testing after? That's what I want to know.
Yes, yes, we might have. Actually, when you get into the architecture section, it's going to be pretty detailed. So you may not want to do a test at the end. So we'll see.
Okay.
All right.
Take it away.
All right. So let me know when you see the screen up on your end. Everybody see the share? Okay, very good. All right, so this is our excellent top 5 DFARS, NSIT, CMMC best practices. And we're basically going to run through these 5 areas. And we didn't post them initially on the overview because we wanted to basically dive into this in more detail on the presentation and put in some extra spins and tips and techniques as we move along. So love your policies, create a CCB, know your CUI, use Office 365 and build on a sound IT. No, this is not a Jeopardy. There won't be any floating tiles in the back, but we're going to dive into each one of these 5 areas and do that within 45 minutes. First off, bird's eye view of this process. Mike's got a really good kind of drill down from the top about how you need to put together an effective roadmap for doing assessments, remediations, and being able to do the planning and process and then move that all the way through to the remediation and monitoring. So, and again, what better guy than Dwight Eisenhower, who built our interstate highway system? You talk about a plan, right? But I love his quote, in preparing for battle, I've always found that plans are useless, but planning is indispensable. So when you get in the heat of battle, a lot of times what you did plan is going to change. And that obviously happens to be the situation with NIST and CMMC. So I'm going to let Mike dive into these first 2 slides in detail, and then we'll kind of move this thing along as quickly as we can.
Okay, thanks, Mike. The first point I want to make is embracing information security is not a strap-on technology. It's not something you're going to do once or plug it in and be done. Really understanding the risk associated with the use of cyber technology is going to require a culture change. We've already experienced a culture change in that we all have adapted to computer technology. We couldn't live without spreadsheets. Quad pads are a thing of the past. We are very dependent on the technology, and it's been very, very easy to use, and that's been both a blessing and a curse. The blessing is it's enhanced productivity. The curse is it was wide open and it brought a lot of risk and threats and vulnerabilities to the system. And we have to learn about that, and we have to learn how to control it. So you're really embracing a change in culture, not just a new technology that fixes everything. So I'm showing here in this slide the overview of the process of gaining conformity are coming into compliance with CMMC or any standard or framework that you choose to work with. You start off with an assessment, a gap analysis, where you are compared. And I guess even before that, you're really adopting a framework. And there's a number of different frameworks you could use. In this case, there's regulations that nominate CMMC as the model or the framework that you're going to be utilizing. So you have to recognize that you've adopted that willingly or otherwise, and you need to achieve conformity with all the different practices within it. So you start off with a gap analysis, your preliminary assessment. How are you doing in terms of conformance? Most of us do very poorly the first time we do that, and it's discouraging, and it's more discouraging because people haven't learned the nomenclature and the techniques yet, and so we've got to deal with that.
A lot of negative SPRS scores out there.
Yeah,
First pass. Absolutely.
A lot of very uncomfortable people. But then once you understand where your gaps are, you move to an architecture that's going to support your current operations and your growth in the future. This, we didn't used to break this out as a separate step, but we have now made it a separate task because you really want to make sure you're using the right structure to build your entire program on. And a lot of people have not, and I've had the unhappy task of telling them that will not work and you'll never get there. And they've had to back up and redo their documentation and repeat a lot of stuff. And we want to avoid that. And a good architecture, one, it's required by the standards, but it really makes a difference on the degree of difficulty it is to implement all the controls. Once you understand the 2B architecture and your gaps, you can lay out a plan of action of how you're going to approach it to come into compliance. And that ends phase one. The other part of phase one is we start a committee we call the IT steering group. Some people call it the change control board. Some people call it the cyber control board. It doesn't matter what you call it, okay?
It just needs to be put in place.
You need to have very senior representation and all the stakeholders in your organization that get involved with determining how this thing is going to be done. So you start the ITSG or the ITSG. Then you move into remediation. We'll talk about the publications. There's a number of plans. You need policies, you need procedures, you need system security plan, and a number of other plans that we'll talk about in more detail later on.
The two new ones down there at the bottom, configuration management and business continuity, are part of the new CMMC standards.
Right. The configuration management's a very important one. Business continuity is really called out from the NFOs in this 800-171. Truth be known, you're not going to get knocked down on CMMC if you don't have a BCP, but you're not a very smart organization if you don't. Everyone should have a business continuity plan. So then you move through remediation to the point that you're fully compliant or conform with the level you choose, and then you move into a sustainment mode. So this is kind of the overall flow at the top level. Why don't we go to the next slide?
You bet.
One of the things that CMMC brings is depth and a lot more documentation. And what we found, in fact, if you look at either NIST 171, or if you look at the CMMC assessment guides for each level, they identify a number of assessment objectives under each of the practices. This is important for everyone to understand because your conformity assessment is going to evaluate every single one of those assessment objectives, and they will be examining and testing at the assessment objective level. And if you don't pass all the assessment objectives, you're not in conformance with the practice. And that's the way it's going to work. And there's a lot more details. Now, how much more? Well, if you go from the 181 practices and processes at level 3 in CMMC, you now have, say, an average of 5 assessment objectives per. So now you're up to 900 auditable items. And then you have to break those apart by system of type. So you have to approve you do it in the cloud, on your servers, on your desktops, on your laptops. So now you have 3 or 4 different systems of type. So now your 900 items becomes nearly 3,000 items. You have to document and prove that you conform to each one of these levels. That's what CMMC does, and it's coming back to 171. So what we have done is developed a progressive 3-level approach. We start off at general fundamental capabilities that you need to have in your information security plan, and we call that the ICE evaluation. We've got about 22 items that we identify, and people start to understand what's involved in information security. Then we do an assessment at the requirements level or the practice level. We don't dive into the assessment objectives yet, and that allows them to understand what the framework is really requiring. We can also do SPRS scoring at this level. And then the final pass, the third pass, is at the assessment objective level. And now they understand the context in which each of these objectives are coming. So I recommend a multi-pass approach where you're progressively moving into more and more detail. Otherwise, it'll just overwhelm you from the beginning. Next slide,
quick caveat here too for the audience, because obviously this is a much more knowledgeable group being involved in DoD contracting. So we didn't bother to dispense with putting up large charts with all of the controls and the processing, because everybody's been mind numbed over the past year and looking at all the changes and modifications. One of the key things here that I think that Imprimis has developed, and what we believe this philosophy and approach for assessment and conformance management is really diving in and understanding all of these areas at a much more granular level, and then coming back and then plugging in. But again, having a great software platform to do that, and where you can document management, do all the iterations, is the real key. So we're going to move on from loving your policies and procedures, because we know a lot of people have spent a lot of time diving into them. We really want to move on to this idea of saying this policies and procedures, you're failing to plan and failing to plan by default, by Ben Franklin. Clear and concise policies and procedures, obviously the foundation of what you're doing, and understanding the uniqueness in CMMC hierarchy. And part of what I think is really a challenge for a lot of small businesses is when they're faced with going through the initial reviews of a lot of the documentation and the policies and the steps and the procedures that go through this, it becomes an almost overwhelming task. And if you can break it down into smaller pieces and phases and get achievement and get success as you move along that pathway, people just tend to stick with it. And this is what you'll see in terms of the approach that Imprimis is take. And Michael, dive in on a couple of slides on this.
All right, this is where I want to introduce the documents that you have to deal with. And this is just a little mind map that I use to keep track of all these things. On the left-hand side, let me start there. You have the policies, and that's called for under the assessment objective on the maturity ML2.999. All right, and it calls for policies by domain. Okay, now there's a lot of different types of policies. You can have strategic policies, system policies, issue policies, and those are the normal type of best practices people use.
You want me to show that next slide and come back to this, Mike?
No, I want to keep going there.
You got it.
Thanks.
You bet.
And the thing you want to be able to do within the policies is make sure that you've adopted so you have every practice covered. And ML 2.999 calls for a policy on each domain. So you need to keep that in mind. And then you have to, from that flows the procedures. On the right-hand side are some of the other documents we'll touch on. System security plan is critical You can't even complete your SPRS score unless you have a active SSP. You need a CUI management plan. You need an incident response plan, and you need to practice the incident response plan. You need a configuration management plan. And this is really where the ITSIG or your management group is controlling the system, but you need to go in and actually talk about settings and configurations as well as your network diagram. So that's a very important one. And then you've got in ML 3.997, people typically call this the resource plan. But if you read it carefully, what they're really asking for is a system management plan. And they're asking for the people, the tasks, as well as the resources. Now, some people tend to fold this into their SSP. Some people keep it separate. It's up to you. And then the last one's the BCP. These are all your plans and documents that you're going to need to really stand up to CMMC. Next slide. So this is, if I were to go into ML 2999, I'm talking about policies. You can see that each one says that you need to establish a policy that includes, and then it identifies the domain name, access control, asset management, etc. If you dive into that control, you can see the assessment objectives that they require are shown here. You need to identify the purpose, the scope, roles and responsibilities, the applicability of the policy. You need to establish the procedures. And they're very big on this. The procedures need to flow from the policies, and the procedures implement the security controls that you actually are implemented. So that's what that achieves conformity, if you will. So the procedures are a very important part. Identify the regulations. You need to show approval or endorsements for the policies, and you need to give a schedule of when they're reviewed and how often they're updated. So when I talk about using your assessment objectives, this is a good example applied to the policies. But the policies really drive kind of everything after them. So whether you back into them or you choose them coming in, what the final set of policies that you end up with are really going to control how you do your information security. Next slide.
Mike, before we go on to the next section, which policy have you found in a lot of the clients that you've worked with over the last decade, which policy causes the most consternation or trouble?
All of them.
Okay, but if you were only going to name one, which one would it be?
People hate policies and
Exactly.
procedures,
Right.
and they're an absolute brick wall.
Exactly.
And they really need to be converted into a very, very usable, very easy to use tool, and something that can be referred to on the how-to.
Sounds like a political answer to me.
Well, it's unfortunately the truth.
That is.
Yeah, the big ones, there's two big ones. Access control, because most of the threats come through people and the compromise of their accounts. Access control ends up being a very complicated domain. You've got a combination of logical solutions, and you have a boatload of procedural solutions that absolutely have to get implemented, including training.
Got it.
So it tends to be a little more complicated.
All right.
System and communication control is a big area, but it's fairly straightforward because there's a lot of logical type solutions.
And again, we're stretching or stressing the methodology and the philosophy versus, hey, here's 40 or 50 processes you got to run through. Everybody's seen those, so we're not going to spend a lot of time on that. So this is one of the key areas that I think I've really seen in Primus's approach be very unique in the marketplace. And even though you've got to have a cybersecurity control board, this IT steering group needs to be a part of that. So you either may have, if you're a small enough company, you might just have a steering group and it's 5 people and they meet together to make it happen. But if you're a much larger organization, you've got board members, top management, you've got to get the rest of the people involved. So this idea of a control board and a steering group, for depending upon the size of your organization, but it's key in learning how to deal with the risk that an organization or an enterprise has, and making sure that it's crossing over those boundaries of not only IT technology, but operational technology, the OT, as well as the IT. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. And again, Henry Ford, if everyone's moving forward, everybody, the success takes care of itself. So here's a quick rundown, and Michael dive into this CCB ITT steering group.
It doesn't matter what you call it. There needs to be a committee that is responsible for the security design within the network, and they need to have the authority to do it. Some people call the CCB Change Control Board. Some people like ITSIG. Some people call it the Technology Steering Group. Don't care what you call it.
Just do it.
You need to have a very senior person, hopefully C-suite type of level, depending on the organization. And then you have the stakeholders represented. And I'll just give you, and we'll move through this quickly, but I have a customer, still a very good customer in the Midwest, and in one of the I states, and I rarely can remember which one, but it's one of the I states, and excellent manufacturing firm. We assessed 2 or 3 years ago. We told them what they needed to do, and 2 years later we came back. They asked us to come back, and they had accomplished absolutely nothing. Okay, we established an ITSIG. It was chaired by the CEO. He makes it once in a while, not all the time, but it brings in all the stakeholders. They have accomplished more in the last 3 months than they did in the previous 3 years. And they're well on their way to compliance and doing a great job. The difference that having this committee makes is night and day, success and failure. Believe me, this is one of the most important things you need to do. So let's move on.
You bet.
I'm just going to touch on this. One of the we work with a lot of manufacturers, and IT versus OT always comes into effect. They're different organizations, they're different people. Again, the steering group brings everyone together. You have a stakeholder from OT as well as IT. You have manufacturing, you have production. You bring them together, they're making decisions, and they're making very sound decisions. This is an area that's becoming more and more and more and more important, because wireless manufacturing, lights out manufacturing, the integration with IT and OT is becoming a huge, huge facet. And you're not going to make this work if you don't pull together a good management group. Next slide.
And just a caveat there, a lot of the industrial critical infrastructure in the country really is going to be depending upon the fusion of these bodies coming together and moving along this pathway to really tighten down physical and logical assets. And that's why I like this idea of the fusion of IT and OT as it's emerging in the marketplace. All right, moving on to our third category, know your CUI. Everybody's been faced with that. Obviously, confidentiality is the essence of being trusted. So if you ain't confidential, you ain't going to be trusted. What was interesting, though, what I found is that I made that point at the bottom. Up until 2010, CUI wasn't even CUI. They had different names for it. And as you know, the government alphabet soup in terms of acronyms, it's probably been called 10 or 15 things over the past 10 years. But I think if you really drill down and understand the differences in the delta of the kinds of CUI data that you have in the organization, how do you chop it up and manage it much more effectively? So let's dive into a couple slides on this.
This slide is one we'll just leave in the briefing for your reference. I picked this up from DoD many years ago now, when they were first rolling out one of the first 171 implementation. But it kind of summarizes where they see the data. you either have a government system that's really controlled by DISA, a DoD system controlled by DISA, or you move into a DoD facility operated by a contractor. They're governed by the same standards, the same rules, and they usually end up with a baseline defined by the National Security Committee on National Security Systems. So, but for the contractors, they made it very clear that you need on a network containing CUI what was originally UCTI, unclassified technical controlled information, now CTI, controlled technical information, and then it became defense covered information, or say covered defense information, CDI, and then CUI kind of took it all in. And I remember years ago them saying, yeah, look at this outside area, it's going to include contract information. And indeed, we now have FCI, federal contract information, right, all of which is controlled stuff. But you can see that it has expanded. And folks are saying, do I have CUI? Do I have not have CUI? I think you need to keep in mind the trend. In the early days, it was only UCTI, and people would argue about what's UCTI. And then they said, all right, now it's CDI. And then people argue about that. Now it's FCI. And now it's CUI. They're concerned about any open source intelligence that can be used by our adversaries. And so if you're ever in doubt on whether something's CUI or not, protect it. You can't get in trouble for protecting non-CUI data. You can get in lots of trouble for not protecting CUI data. Absolutely. Next slide, please. So what we do as part of the architecture development is, and there's many different ways of doing this, but we sit down and do a data flow diagram. And this is a very simple, but very revealing exercise we do with our clients. We'll go in, and this is a typical manufacturing facility. We'll identify what are the major functions. You've got finance, of course, you have marketing and sales and purchasing and engineering and quality and production. You have outside customers, you have outside supply chain. So we start going through saying, what data do you have? What communications between these entities take place? And they're very quick to say, oh, we exchange drawings here, this data, that. And then we say, which of it's CUI or could be CUI? And whenever they say, yeah, there could be CUI, it turns red. So we know where the CUI is flowing within the organization. But by the time you finish this very simple exercise, you got lines going all over the place. And it becomes very clear to the owners of the business or the proprietors that they make massive use of CUI, and it's flowing in a lot of locations, and they have to pay attention. It really starts clarifying in their minds what the scope of the CUI problem is. We also show little databases by each of these functions. They become the main data shares where you're storing data. You can then appoint someone as the data owner and controls who has access to that data and how it flows. But you can now take this data and start designing your system. So this is a very important part of the architecture. And just think about it. This is an information system security program. If you don't know where your data is, you don't know where it flows to, how can you possibly put together a program to protect it? So this is a critical function. It needs to be part of your CUI management plan. It needs to be part of your system security plan. And you need to capture the flow of your data, and particularly the flow of the CUI data. And everyone needs to understand it. And so let me leave it at there. I'm happy to talk with anyone if you want to dive into more detail, but having a data flow diagram and understanding where and how it moves all your CUI is absolutely critical to your plan.
And what's interesting here, this looks like a really messy network, because usually that's what they are when you first uncover, pull away the sheets and look under the bed covers that see what your network's all about. But what you'll find is that this actually lays the groundwork for the IT architecture design work that you're going to do later. And we'll dive into that in section 5. But one more piece here on 365 and shared email services, obviously Azure clouds. CMMC has really, I think, in the last probably year and a half, pushed to the fore this idea of having a completely managed WAN and LAN email database Teams management architecture. Microsoft, has done a tremendous job in pursuing this and nailing it down and making it secure. They jumped onto the government model early on, and obviously put together a lot of tools. However, there are a lot of permutations of Office 365 on the commercial side, on the government side, on the DoD side. So we hope to, in a few slides here, help to demystify some of that and kind of steer you towards the right direction. So Mike, you got 3 slides on this one.
So the DFARS, whether it's calling on CMMC or 171, requires certain things to be done with regard to incident reporting, forensic analysis associated with that, and it's referred to as paragraph C through G, and people get confused on this, but basically, the government is requiring that that anytime where if you use a cloud service provider or you use your own system, you need to be able to, when you have an incident, isolate it, preserve the media, capture the malware, report it to DibNet and your prime contractor, and it's a contractual issue. Now, if you go into NIST 171 or CMMC, you will find that Office 365 commercial meets all the security requirements. It does not meet the DFAR requirements. So that requires you do something else. And one of the things you can do is move to GCC High or GCC. Microsoft is now saying that they're willing to accept the flow down to the DFARS clause at GCC, the first level within the government community cloud. But if you handle any ITAR data, you're going to have to be at GCC High anyway.
Right.
So this is a requirement that most people miss. And it's everyone knows you need a cloud service provider that meets the FedRAMP moderate baseline certification, but they don't read the next part of the sentence, which says you also have to have a CSP that is willing to accept paragraph C through G of this
which I think is on the next slide, Mike.
Yep.
Here.
So
we'll come back to that.
These are the clauses within the DFARS that are important, and they basically say you have limited possibilities. Now, there is one other firm that I know of, and I'm sure there's others that will try to come into the market, but Microsoft has positioned it so beautifully. It is the solution. It's called the Government Community Cloud, and you can move your operations or the part of the operations that is CUI specific into GCC or GCC High in the Microsoft cloud, and you're going to meet all of the requirements. It's a non-trivial exercise, so you need to get moving. The other company that is offering some capability in this area is a company called Prevail, Predeil, and they run software which is FIPS 140-2 compliant, and they have in the AWS GovCloud, they have data storage. It more runs as an SMB client, but and it's not for everybody, but in some cases it may work and it would offer an alternative. But just understanding, and this is not necessarily a CMMC thing. It also applies to 171. It's really driven by the DFARS subpart itself and the 7012 clause that gets flowed down. You need to be in one of these government environments that is carefully controlled, and you need to make sure that all of the encryption that you use, which should be plentiful, is a validated, not in compliance with, but a validated FIPS 140-2 software. And that requirement is a pain in the neck.
Very expensive from what I understand.
There's, you'll find the latest versions if you're patching have not been validated yet, and it creates a problem. So you need to be aware of it and manage it going in up front.
So just so everybody knows, and we'll provide the slide deck here up on the site when we're done. This is the deep drill down detail when you really want to understand the difference between commercial, GCC, high, as well as DoD. And again, there's a ton of information on Microsoft's site covering all of this. But what we found was there are a lot of these little loopholes that you got to be aware of, and you can get very expensive in putting together a full-blown solution. All right, let's move on to our last topic. We've got about 6 slides here, so this is going to be a slog for you all, but I think you'll find this quite revealing because obviously simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. Now, some people think, well, Mike, that sounds like an oxymoron. Isn't IT architectures absolutely complicated? Yeah, but if you approach them with your data flow analysis pre-worked out and you identify the WAN and LAN models that you're working with, you now have the ability to do boundaries and edge devices and firewalls in a much more cleaner, simplistic fashion. So one of the things I like about and really stressing with your customers the need for a sound IT architecture, and Mike just hammers this. He probably gets me more when I don't talk about it in a sales call with a customer, is we need to include this architecture design in our initial work with the client. But this is really true in putting together the NIST and CMMC compliances. And I'm going to let Mike dive into this 6-slide section, and we're kind of rounding the corner here at 11:37. Go ahead, Mike.
Okay, so the architecture, if you go to the NIST documentation, makes very clear, and this is absolutely the truth. You start the architecture, the peak of the pyramid is what are your business objectives? The architecture must support what your business objectives are. You then move down the chain and what is the business information? What is the data? And as you're moving down, you're decomposing this into the components of what is data and what are the technologies that you're using. So you can see on the right there, the top part of the architecture pyramid is all business driven, and the bottom part is technology driven. And it's important that you get all of this right before you start moving all your people into it, before you start moving all your enterprise applications into it. The architecture is just critically important, not just the technology part, but the operational part as well. Let's hit the next slide. So this is something that all my classes have to suffer through. And
But wait, is this the dendritic charts, Mike?
no, this is one of them.
Dendritic charts, folks. Remember that term.
Many. But here's what folks need to understand, because information security really stretches throughout your entire organization. When you're implementing security, you really have to include a number of things. First, you have to have the right governance. You have to have the management that lays out the policies that describes how the company is going to operate. They're used to doing this in non-technical areas. They need to do it in information security as well. So anytime you're trying to achieve conformity, you have to have the governance behind it. When you look at, all right, now I have the governance, how does it get implemented? How do you maintain it? It requires management. Management can be high at the IT steering group, or it can be someone appointed to do patching or some type of vulnerability scanning or some very specific task. But someone is in charge of it, someone is accountable, and you have to make sure that's clearly defined. Then you define what is the security thing I'm doing. And you can have a physical security device, a lock, prox guard entry, whatever. You're going to have a logical, and the logical is your hardware and software, your firewall, your intrusion detection. These are logical solutions. That your endpoint protection is a very important one. And of course, encryption is a core competency all unto its own. And all your encryption, again, I have to HARP 140-2 validated. And then finally, you have to have a way of monitoring and making sure that it's working and making sure that it's being maintained. So you need the oversight, you need the monitoring, and this is all of this has to be in place for you to achieve conformity.
Okay.
The other thing you need to think about that's coming with CMMC is your zone analysis. Zone 1 is your highly sensitive CUI data. Zone 2 is your segmentation, which is one of the requirements of the standard. That would be your firewall, your switches, and your infrastructure, where you can separate things into different segments. Zone 3 is your security devices. So when you're doing vulnerability scanning, when you're doing continuous monitoring, when you're doing endpoint protection, et cetera, all these logical devices have links out to the cloud, to some support level, and you have a zone that you have to isolate them in and make sure that they are properly covered. If you're using interim devices, a bastion host, if you will, to achieve a zone where your CUI data is, that's considered zone 4. You've got the enterprise architecture wrapped around it, and then you have your supply chain and your subcontractors. All of these have to be considered in your architecture. The security for all these have to be in place, and you need to define this as part of your architecture to include your subs and your support supply chain.
Yes.
So you'll end up with something like that looks like this, and this obviously is notional architecture, but one we frequently use, and one that that kind of defines the boundary. Remember, in your system security plan, you have to define the boundary and the environment. Your boundary is wherever you have CUI is the boundary. All the devices that contain or store, process, or transmit CUI is part of your boundary. So what you have here on the left is your cloud components. And typically we use Cisco a lot, we use Fortinet a lot. And so we will end up with a Microsoft cloud, probably GCC high, an Azure GovCloud where we're storing the data. We have security controls that are appended to that. Then we have the security controls that also controls our network. We can have stay-at-home workers, and thanks to COVID, we have a lot more of those. And then we have the headquarter facilities, the office facilities. They're all segmented. They're all behind a firewall. You can connect these through a software-defined WAN, or you connect them to the internet. But this is an architecture. So you're deciding how you're going to accomplish things, what's in your boundary condition, and then you can start securing these items with the selection of procedures, physical controls, and your logical controls. And then you figure out how you're going to monitor. Next slide. Another view of segmentation. New generation firewalls will always support segmentation. And their new generation firewalls are important for 2 reasons. One is they have a lot of security built into it. They have IDS. You can have boundary routers. You can have antivirus, DNS filtering. You can add on mail filtering. You can add on many things in your firewall. And you need these things, and you establish them in your policies, and it's very important. You also need segmentation for a number of reasons. One is, once you establish segmentation, you will give permission for a device or a segment to communicate with another segment. By restricting that, it's kind of like bulkheads on a ship. If you spring a leak, you can close the door and only one compartment gets flooded, right? You only lose data in one area. But the other thing that a segmentation does is every time you have traffic going from one segment to the other, it gets scrubbed by all the security devices again. So it's important to segment, and it's important to have new generation firewall.
I'm surprised how many companies do not do this. And it's probably the least expensive security you can put in place, even though the devices and the software and the people are expensive. This is a great fix to solve a lot of problems.
Yep. All right, here's some other options. Small businesses, stay-at-home offices. You can put a firewall in behind a home router so the family can keep all their data, but all the business is behind a new generation firewall. Or you can have, it can either be a small office or a home office, and you can just drop in a firewall, have one or two segments to keep everything separated. But you still get all the security of the big guys.
Exactly.
So,
all right, we covered all 5 areas. We did a drill down as best we could in the time allowed. I think we're coming up on about 10 minutes till. No, there won't be a complete, I guess she went ahead and canceled the, I did want to do one more thing here at the end. Jenny, can I pop me back up again real quick? On the share. I think you're on mute. I just wanted to put a quick slide up there.
I'm sorry.
That's okay. Yeah, it looked like the share got cut off there real quick. I just wanted to show a quick overview on what we do and how we do it, some of the services we offer. We're pretty much soup to nuts service provider with products and templates and tools and consulting. And we're here to take you through the process from A to Z. And basically, we really appreciate the time to make a presentation. Anybody have any questions? We put everybody to sleep. Is that it?
Oh, no. I have a ton of questions, and I'm really grateful that you guys were on. I met Michael Semmens a long time ago when I was doing something called Rocket City GovCon, and his nephew came to it, and that's how long I've known him. And I was so impressed the day we had a meeting, we did video teleconferencing, which was such a big deal in those days.
What year was that? What year was that?
Oh my!
Don't tell him, Jenny.
I don't know. It would have been early on, maybe 3 years into the company.
Okay.
But we've been buddies ever since. So out in Colorado, and that was one of the reasons why I wanted to have Imprimis as part of this, because I know how long he's been involved in this and how extensive the knowledge is. And that's really what everybody's looking for. Where can I find answers? And who can I talk to? And want to have people have choices to solve these problems and different ways to do it. And I feel like one of the things that I was thinking as you're going through all of this, it's like, okay, I'm not a government contractor, but oh, good, I'm using Microsoft 365. And when I was getting ready to roll this out, my IT guy said, Jenny, we're going to have to get you off of Gmail. And it's been very painful to go through that. And even with trying to transition over to Teams instead of Zoom, I really thought about that a lot, but I said, I can't learn it fast enough to make this work. And I think that's really what everybody's running into. It's not just the cost, it's the shift and wondering, how do I do enough? And what I thought of when you were talking about, I remember this rule about incident reporting. And it's kind of like, okay, you've got to put all of these processes in place so you'd know about an incident so you could report it. And if you report it, do they shut you down? What happens?
No, it's a good question, because people dread this type of thing a lot. The most likely way of finding out that you've experienced an incident is when you do continuous monitoring. Now, there's been a number of times we've had to call our clients in the morning and say, last night you had 5,000 failed login attempts from China. to your Office 365 and you had 5 successful attempts from Nigeria, we need to investigate. And that's when it starts. If you don't have monitoring, you wouldn't know it. And so that's that's why the continuous monitoring, that's why they're saying you need these things is to understand. Sometimes people will say, hey, something's weird, check it out. And that does happen for sure. But more than not, it's found out through some of the monitoring type of activities. It's very important to quickly do triage and make a determination whether you think it measured up to an incident. So that means they were able to gain access to your system, and whether you think they stole data or not, they had access to data. You've got an incident you need to report. Within 72 hours, you got to have the report to DibNet, and you have to continue on with the forensic investigation. So that calls in a number of things. One is you need to have a team ready to go at all times. You don't have to have them as employees. We serve that function for a lot of our clients, and we don't go, we don't start charging or go into action until there's an incident. But you've got to have that capability on hand, and it's got to be at the other end of a phone when you pick up a phone. 2, you need to be ready to continue that to completion. And I'm here to tell you the forensic analysis is expensive. So get cyber insurance.
Absolutely.
You absolutely should have cybersecurity insurance, and they will pay for it. The cyber insurance team will be part of your instant response team, whether you want them or not. But you absolutely need to have insurance, and then you submit the report, and they will evaluate it. They will call if they have questions. What the government's looking for are patterns and things that represent larger threats. So on a couple of the instances we've had NCIS, it's not the TV program, but the real Navy investigative arm, calling us up and asking us about what happened on this incident, that. No one gets into trouble as long as you report it and you take the right steps. The government understands these things happen and they want to know about it. So
listen, Jenny, I know we've got one more question in here. Someone asked, do they know ISO 27001 and how that relates to CMMC? Do we have time to answer that, or do you got to roll out at the top of the hour?
Fast. We got to roll out at top of the hour.
Yeah.
But
27001 is nice. It's not a substitute. There has been no reciprocity defined for CMMC 171 and 27001. So it's nice if you're in compliance with 27001.
Right. It's good to have it.
Getting into compliance with 171 should be very easy, but it is not a substitute, and there's no reciprocity.
Yeah, we have a lot of customers that come to the table and say, hey, I've got these standards already lined up. Does that help me in my process? And we say, absolutely. If you've done any policy work at all, it can be pushed forward and used as raw material. So Jenny, that's our presentation. Hopefully we've covered the boundaries of these 5 top best practices. I know it was 30 slides, but we got through them in 45 minutes. So.
Well, you guys did a fabulous job. I learned a lot from that session, and I know everybody else really appreciates your showing the graphics, and that's exactly what I expected from you, Mike Semmens, because that's what your pool structure looked like when you first showed it to me.
Yeah, but guess who had to put together the slide presentation?
Well, it was brilliant. Very well done.